They say the cruelest betrayals are the ones that arrive quietly, disguised as truth. The storm rolled in without warning, a violent curtain of rain sweeping across the glass walls of the Hale estate, turning the world outside into a blur of shadows and silver streaks, and inside, everything felt colder than the night itself, as Ava Monroe stood barefoot on the marble floor, one hand instinctively resting over the gentle curve of her stomach. Her breathing steady despite the chaos pressing in from every direction, while across the room, Sebastian Hale, billionaire, visionary, the man who once memorized the sound of her laughter, watched her as if she were a stranger who had somehow wandered into his life uninvited. His expression controlled, precise, unreadable in a way that made the silence between them feel heavier than any words could have been. And for a moment, just a moment, Ava searched his face for something familiar, something human, but found only distance where love had once lived. And then he spoke, his voice low and even, cutting through the storm with surgical calm, asking a question that did not seek truth but confirmed a decision already made. Is it mine? And the world seemed to still in that instant, not because of the question itself, but because of everything it erased, the years, the promises, the quiet mornings and late-night whispers, all reduced to a single doubt planted by someone who understood exactly how to break something that had once been unshakable. Ava did not flinch, did not raise her voice, because somewhere deep inside, she understood that this moment was not about proving anything. It was about witnessing who he had chosen to become, and her fingers tightened slightly against the soft fabric of her dress as she met his gaze with a calm that did not beg, did not defend, only existed, steady and unyielding. You already decided, she replied, her voice soft but unwavering, and outside. Thunder rolled across the sky like a verdict being delivered. Sebastian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he turned away, as if even a second longer in her presence required more than he was willing to give, and the papers on the table, crisp, untouched, final, spoke louder than anything else in the room. The ink already dry on a future he had rewritten without her, and Ava's eyes drifted to the window where rain collided endlessly against the glass, each drop dissolving into the next, indistinguishable, relentless, like the truth that no longer mattered here. And slowly, almost absently, her hand slipped from her stomach to the ring on her finger, the metal cool against her skin, a symbol that had once meant forever, and for a brief second, she held it there, feeling the weight of everything it represented before letting her hand fall back to her side, not removing it, not yet, because some endings did not need to be rushed, they simply needed to be understood, and when she finally moved, it was not toward him but toward the door, her steps quiet against the polished floor, each one measured, deliberate, as if she were already stepping into a life he could no longer see, and Sebastian did not stop her, did not call her name, because the storm outside was easier to face than the truth standing right in front of him. And as the door opened, the wind rushed in, carrying with it the scent of rain and something colder, something final, and Ava paused just long enough to take a breath that felt like both an ending and a beginning before walking forward into the night, the door closing behind her with a softness that echoed far louder than a slam ever could, leaving the storm to speak for everything they no longer would. The rain did not stop when Ava stepped beyond the gates of the Hale estate. It followed her, clinging to her skin, soaking through the thin fabric of her dress, as if the night itself refused to let her go. And for a moment she stood there on the empty driveway, the towering mansion behind her glowing with cold, distant light, a place that had once felt like home now reduced to nothing more than a silhouette against the storm. And she did not look back, not because it did not hurt, but because looking back would have meant hoping, and hope had already been taken from her the moment Sebastian chose silence over truth, and so she walked forward, one step at a time, her shoes abandoned somewhere between the marble floor and the gravel path, her bare feet meeting the cold ground with a quiet resilience that no one was there to witness, and the city lights in the distance blurred through the rain like a promise she had not yet decided to believe in, while miles away, in the warmth of his study, Sebastian Hale stood alone, the sound of the storm muted by glass and steel, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened window, sharp and composed, exactly as the world expected him to be. Yet something beneath that surface had shifted, something subtle and unwelcome, like a crack in polished stone, and his gaze drifted to the folder resting on his desk, the one that had arrived earlier that evening, filled with carefully arranged evidence, photographs, timestamps, statements that painted a story so convincing it required no questions, only acceptance, and he had accepted it, because it had been easier than confronting the possibility that he could be wrong, easier than admitting that trust required courage. And as thunder rolled across the sky, he reached for the glass of untouched whiskey beside him, but did not drink, his hand pausing midair as a memory surfaced uninvited. Ava laughing softly in the kitchen weeks ago, sunlight catching in her hair as she spoke about the future with a certainty that had once anchored him. And for a fraction of a second, doubt flickered, small but persistent, before he set the glass down with deliberate care, his expression hardening once more, because doubt was inconvenient, and he had built his entire life on control, on decisions made without hesitation. And across the city, Ava found herself at a quiet bus stop, the flickering overhead light casting pale shadows across the empty street, her arms wrapped around herself not from the cold, but from the weight of everything she carried. And when the bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the rain like a quiet rescue, she stepped inside without a word, the driver offering a brief glance that held no judgment, only recognition of someone who had nowhere else to go, and she sank into a seat near the window, watching as the world outside slipped past in blurred streaks of light and darkness, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. No longer the woman who had walked through marble halls and attended charity galas, but someone stripped down to something simpler, something real, and her hand returned to her stomach, a silent promise forming in the space where fear might have lived, because even as everything else had been taken from her, this one truth remained untouched, undeniable, and hers alone. And as the bus carried her farther from the life she had known, Ava Monroe did not cry, she did not break, because somewhere deep within the quiet, something stronger had begun to take shape, something that did not need belief from anyone else to exist. And for the first time since the storm began, her breathing steadied, not because the pain was gone, but because she understood that this was not the end, it was the moment everything changed. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale gray light stretching across the city as if the night had never fully left, and Ava Monroe stepped off the bus with the same quiet determination she had carried through the storm, her clothes still damp at the edges, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested control even when everything else felt uncertain, and the street before her was unfamiliar, lined with modest apartment buildings and small storefronts just beginning to open, nothing like the world she had walked away from. Yet there was something grounding in its simplicity, something honest that did not require perfection or pretense, and she paused for a moment beneath the faded awning of a corner diner, the smell of coffee drifting into the cool morning air, steady and unassuming, and without hesitation she stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly, as if marking the beginning of something new. And the woman behind the counter looked up with a brief, knowing glance, not asking questions, not offering pity, just nodding toward an empty booth by the window. And Ava slid into the seat, her hand once again finding its way to her stomach, the gesture no longer instinctive but intentional, as if grounding herself in the one truth that remained unshaken. And when the waitress approached, Ava ordered coffee and a simple breakfast, her voice calm, her tone measured, as though she had already begun to rebuild the version of herself that would survive this. And across the city, Sebastian Hale stood in a boardroom filled with polished glass and sharp suits, the kind of room where decisions shaped industries and reputations were built or broken in a matter of minutes. Yet today, something felt off, subtle but persistent, like a rhythm slightly out of sync, and as his colleagues spoke, presenting numbers and projections with practiced confidence, his attention drifted, not entirely, but enough that he noticed the absence of something he could not immediately name. And when his phone vibrated against the table, he glanced down to see a message from his assistant confirming that all personal matters had been handled, the phrasing precise, impersonal, final, and he responded with a single word, efficient and detached, before setting the phone aside. Yet the sense of completion it should have brought did not follow. instead leaving behind a quiet emptiness that lingered beneath his composed exterior. And back in the diner, Ava wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug, the heat seeping into her fingers, steadying her in a way that felt almost symbolic, and she allowed herself a single moment to breathe, not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge that she was still here, still moving forward. And when the plate of food arrived, she ate slowly, deliberately, not out of hunger alone but out of necessity, understanding that strength was not built in grand gestures but in small, consistent choices. And as she finished, she reached into her bag, retrieving the few essentials she had taken with her, a wallet, a phone, and a folded document that caught her attention, its edges slightly worn, and when she opened it, her eyes lingered on the words she had almost forgotten, a certification, a qualification, a piece of her identity that existed long before the Hale name had ever entered her life. And for the first time since the storm, something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to create space where possibility could begin to grow. And she folded the paper carefully, placing it back into her bag with intention, as if reclaiming a part of herself that had never truly been lost. And outside, the clouds began to thin, the first hints of sunlight breaking through in quiet defiance of the night that had come before, and Ava Monroe stood, leaving a few bills on the table before stepping back onto the street, her posture straight, her head steady, because even without looking back, she understood something Sebastian Hale did not, that endings were not defined by what was taken, but by what one chose to build next. The city moved forward as it always did, indifferent to the quiet battles fought within its streets. And Ava Monroe walked with a sense of direction that had nothing to do with familiarity and everything to do with decision, her steps carrying her toward a modest brick building just 3 blocks from the diner, its sign slightly weathered but still standing with quiet pride, Monroe Health Outreach, a name she had not spoken out loud in years, yet one that still held weight in her chest. And for a moment she stood at the entrance, her reflection faint in the glass door. Not the woman she had been in polished penthouses and curated rooms, but someone stripped down to purpose. And when she pushed the door open, the soft hum of activity greeted her, phones ringing, voices exchanging information, a world that did not pause for heartbreak. And behind the front desk, a young receptionist looked up with polite curiosity that quickly shifted into recognition, not of her status, but of her presence, the kind that carried quiet authority. And Ava offered a small nod before asking for access to the back office, her voice calm, steady, and the words felt different now, not borrowed from a life shared with someone else, but fully her own. And within minutes, she found herself standing in a modest workspace filled with files, notes, and the remnants of a mission she had once built with passion before life had taken her in another direction. And as her fingers traced the edge of a desk she had once used, memory did not overwhelm her. It aligned her, reminding her of who she had always been before love had reshaped her priorities. And she reached for a folder, flipping it open to review programs that had once been active, community outreach, maternal care initiatives, support systems for women who had nowhere else to turn. And something inside her sharpened, not from anger, but from clarity, because she understood now that what she had lost was not everything. It was simply one chapter. And across the city, Sebastian Hale sat in his office long after the boardroom had emptied, the skyline stretching endlessly before him, yet offering no sense of accomplishment, and the reports on his desk remained untouched, his focus drawn instead to the subtle absence that had followed him throughout the day, a quiet disturbance that refused to be ignored. And when his phone lit up again, this time with a call from the same source that had delivered the information leading to his decision, he answered without hesitation, his tone controlled, expecting confirmation, reinforcement, something to solidify the certainty he had chosen. But the voice on the other end carried a different weight, a slight hesitation that did not belong in conversations built on precision. And as the words unfolded, not contradicting, but clarifying, adding details that had not been presented before, Sebastian's expression shifted, not visibly to anyone else, but internally. The kind of shift that disrupted the foundation of a belief he had accepted too quickly, and his grip on the phone tightened almost imperceptibly before he ended the call with a single acknowledgement, placing the device back on the desk with deliberate care, And for the first time since the storm, he did not reach for control, he reached for understanding, yet found himself without immediate answers. And back at Monroe Health Outreach, Ava had already begun making calls, reconnecting with former partners, reviewing budgets, reactivating a system that had once thrived under her direction, her movements efficient, her focus unwavering. And as the hours passed, the space around her transformed, not physically, but in energy, from something dormant into something alive again. And when she finally paused, stepping back from the desk, her hand resting once more over her stomach, the gesture no longer one of protection but of promise, because what she was building now was not just for survival, it was for legacy. And outside, the sun had fully broken through the clouds, casting light across the city in a way that felt earned, not given. And Ava Monroe did not need to look back to know that the storm had ended, because she had already begun something stronger than anything it had tried to take away. Time did not announce its passing. It simply moved, quiet and relentless, shaping everything it touched without asking permission. And months later, the modest office of Monroe Health Outreach no longer felt like a forgotten space, but a place in motion, filled with purpose, with voices, with lives intersecting in ways that mattered. And Ava Monroe stood at the center of it all, not as someone reclaiming what was lost, but as someone building something entirely her own, her posture steady, her presence composed, the soft curve of her pregnancy now unmistakable beneath tailored fabrics that spoke of quiet strength rather than display. And as she reviewed a stack of reports detailing expanded programs and growing partnerships, her focus remained precise, each decision grounded not in ambition alone, but in understanding, because she had lived the very uncertainty she now worked to ease for others. And when a colleague approached with an update on a new maternal care initiative, Ava listened fully, asking questions that cut to the core of what mattered, not numbers alone, but impact, sustainability, dignity, and the conversation flowed with an ease that came from clarity of purpose rather than the need to prove anything. And across the city, Sebastian Hale found himself revisiting details he had once accepted without hesitation. The file that had justified his actions now reopened on his desk, its contents no longer carrying the same certainty they once had. And as he studied the images again, the timestamps, the carefully framed narratives, something began to unravel, not dramatically, but enough to reveal inconsistencies that should have been obvious, yet had been overlooked, and his expression remained controlled. But beneath that control, realization moved slowly, deliberately, like a tide that could not be pushed back. And he reached for his phone, making a call not to confirm what he already believed, but to question it, his tone still calm, still measured, yet carrying an edge that had not been there before, because control without truth was no longer enough. And back at the outreach center, Ava stepped outside for a brief moment, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow across the street, a contrast to the storm that had marked her departure from a different life. And she allowed herself a pause, not to reflect on what had been, but to acknowledge what was, her hand resting lightly over her stomach as she felt a subtle movement that grounded her completely in the present. And there was no fear in that moment, only a quiet certainty that whatever lay ahead, she would meet it on her own terms. And when she returned inside, the rhythm of the space welcomed her back without hesitation, calls to answer, plans to finalize, lives to support. And she moved through it all with a sense of belonging that did not rely on titles or recognition. And as evening approached, she gathered her things, preparing to leave, her steps unhurried, her mind already outlining the next phase of growth, while across the skyline, Sebastian stood once more by the window of his office, the city lights beginning to flicker on below, his reflection no longer as steady as it had once been, because certainty had been replaced with something far more difficult to manage, the possibility that he had not only been wrong, but that he had acted on that wrongness in a way that could not simply be undone. And for the first time since the night everything changed, he did not feel in control of the outcome, only aware of its weight. And somewhere within that awareness, a question formed, not spoken, not yet acted upon, but impossible to ignore. While miles away, Ava Monroe walked into the evening with a calm that did not seek validation, because what she was building now was not a response to loss. It was a declaration of who she had always been, and this time, nothing would. Take that away. The weeks that followed did not slow down. They accelerated, as if the life Ava Monroe had chosen was determined to test every part of her resolve. And yet she met each demand with a quiet precision that turned pressure into structure, her days beginning before sunrise and ending long after the city had dimmed, not out of necessity alone but out of intention, because every decision she made now carried weight beyond herself. And the outreach center continued to grow, its reach extending into neighborhoods that had once been overlooked, its programs gaining attention not through marketing but through results. And Ava stood at the center of it all with a calm authority that did not need to be announced, only felt, her presence steady, her voice measured, her focus unwavering. And when the first major partnership offer arrived, a regional healthcare network proposing to fund expansion in exchange for strategic alignment, she did not rush to accept. Instead, she reviewed every detail, every clause, every implication, understanding that growth without control was simply another form of loss. And across the city, Sebastian Hale sat in a private meeting with an investigative consultant. The file now expanded beyond its original contents, new reports layered over old assumptions. And as the consultant spoke, outlining discrepancies that suggested manipulation rather than truth, Sebastian listened without interruption, his expression composed, but his silence carried a different weight now. Not indifference, but recognition. And when the consultant paused, waiting for direction, Sebastian's response was quiet but decisive. "Find everything," he said, not raising his voice, not showing urgency. Yet the command held a finality that left no room for interpretation, because this was no longer about confirming a belief, it was about confronting a mistake. And the difference between the two was something he understood too well. And later that evening, as the city settled into its usual rhythm of lights and motion, Ava remained in her office, reviewing projections for the next phase of expansion, her hand occasionally resting over her stomach, a habit that had become less about reassurance and more about connection. And when a subtle movement answered her touch, she allowed herself a brief smile, small but genuine, a moment that existed entirely outside of business plans and strategic decisions. And for a second, the world narrowed to something simple, something certain, before she returned to her work with the same clarity that had carried her this far and miles away. Sebastian stood alone in his home, the silence within the walls more noticeable than ever, not because the space had changed, but because he had. And as he moved through rooms that once held shared moments, he noticed details he had overlooked before: the absence of warmth, the absence of presence, the absence of her. And it was not dramatic, not overwhelming, but persistent, a quiet realization that settled in slowly, refusing to be ignored. And when he finally stopped in the center of the living room, his gaze falling to the empty space where she had once stood, the memory did not come as comfort. It came as contrast, a clear line between what had been and what he had allowed himself to believe. And for the first time, the certainty he had relied on felt incomplete, not because he lacked control, but because control had not protected him from being wrong. And across the city, Ava Monroe closed her office for the night, stepping out into the cool air with a sense of purpose that had not diminished, her steps steady, her path clear, because while some truths were still unfolding beyond her awareness, she no longer needed them to move forward. She had already begun building something stronger than any lie could destroy, and this time, she was not waiting for anyone to understand it. The invitation arrived without ceremony, a simple envelope placed among a stack of routine correspondence on Ava Monroe's desk, its weight unremarkable, yet its presence quietly insistent, and she almost set it aside without a second glance, her attention already committed to a schedule that left little room for distraction. But something about the embossed lettering caught her eye, precise and understated. And when she opened it, her gaze settled on the details with calm focus: a charity gala hosted by one of the largest healthcare foundations in the state, an event designed to showcase innovation and leadership in community care. And at the bottom, a single line that shifted the moment from ordinary to intentional: Monroe Health Outreach had been selected as a featured partner. And for a brief second, the room seemed to still, not because of surprise, but because of recognition. This was not an opportunity, it was a statement. And across the city, Sebastian Hale stood in a dimly lit office reviewing the final report delivered by his investigator. The file now complete in a way that left no room for interpretation, every detail aligned, every inconsistency resolved. And the truth, when it finally stood on its own, was not loud. It was precise, undeniable, and deeply inconvenient, because it revealed not just that he had been misled, but that he had chosen not to question what he was given. And his eyes moved slowly across the final page, the name of the person responsible no longer hidden behind assumptions or careful omissions. And he did not react outwardly, his expression remaining composed. But something beneath that composure shifted in a way that could not be reversed, and when he closed the file, the sound was quiet, controlled, yet final, as if marking the end of one certainty and the beginning of another. And back in her office, Ava placed the invitation down with deliberate care, her mind already moving through the implications, the visibility, the potential partnerships, the impact it could bring to the work she had built from the ground up. And yet beneath that analysis, there was something else, not hesitation, not fear, but awareness, because events like this existed in a world she had once been part of, a world she had walked away from without looking back, and now it stood before her again, not as a memory, but as a stage. And when her assistant stepped in to confirm attendance, Ava's response was immediate, calm, and without uncertainty. "We will be there," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had defined every step of her journey forward. And as the days moved closer to the event, preparations unfolded with precision, schedules adjusted, presentations refined, details aligned not for appearance, but for purpose. And on the evening of the gala, the city shimmered with a familiar elegance, lights reflecting off glass and steel, creating a backdrop that felt both distant and known. And Ava stood before the mirror in her apartment, not surrounded by excess, but by intention, her dress simple yet striking, a deep tone that carried both strength and grace, her posture steady, her gaze clear. And when she adjusted the final detail, there was no trace of the woman who had once walked into a storm with nothing but silence, only the presence of someone who had rebuilt herself with precision and purpose. And as she stepped out into the night, the air cool against her skin, there was no hesitation in her movement, only direction, because this was not a return to the past. It was an arrival into something entirely her own, and across the same skyline, Sebastian Hale, prepared for the same event, unaware that the moment he would soon face was not just a consequence of his actions, but the beginning of understanding what he had truly lost. The ballroom shimmered under cascading crystal light, every surface reflecting a version of perfection carefully curated for those who believed in appearances. And Ava Monroe stepped inside with a presence that did not demand attention, yet commanded it all the same, her movements unhurried, her posture composed, the quiet confidence she carried more striking than any elaborate display. And conversations softened subtly as she passed, not out of recognition of who she had been, but of who she clearly was. Someone who did not need introduction to be understood. And as she moved further into the room, her focus remained steady, acknowledging greetings with polite nods, engaging only when necessary. Because tonight was not about proving anything. It was about representing something real. And across the same space, Sebastian Hale stood among a circle of familiar faces, his expression controlled, his demeanor unchanged to anyone observing from a distance. Yet his attention was no longer anchored to the conversations around him, instead shifting towards something he could not yet define, a subtle awareness that moved through the room like an unspoken signal. And when he finally turned, his gaze landing across the expanse of polished marble and soft light, the moment did not arrive with noise, it arrived with clarity. Ava stood there, not as a memory, not as a possibility, but as reality, and for a fraction of a second, the carefully maintained control he carried faltered, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to understand that what he was seeing could not be dismissed or reshaped into something convenient. She had not returned to him, she had arrived without him, and the difference was absolute. And Ava felt it too, not as a pull, not as hesitation, but as recognition, the presence of someone who had once defined a part of her life now existing within a space she no longer needed to navigate carefully. And when their eyes met, There was no shock in her expression, no question, only a calm acknowledgement, as if she had already accounted for this moment long before it occurred, and she did not turn away, did not retreat, because there was nothing left to avoid. And across the distance, Sebastian held her gaze for a second longer than expected, not searching for explanation, but confronting the undeniable contrast between the woman he had left behind and the one standing before him now. And before he could move, before the space between them could close or expand, the evening's program shifted, the host stepping onto the stage to introduce the featured partners, voices rising again, attention redirecting toward the front of the room, and Ava moved with quiet intention, stepping forward when her name was called, the lights adjusting to frame her presence as she reached the podium, her composure unchanged, her voice steady as she began to speak, not about herself, but about the work, the impact, the lives that had been supported, and the ones still waiting, and every word carried weight not because it was crafted to impress, but because it was grounded in truth, and throughout the room, attention settled fully, not on her past, but on what she had built. And Sebastian listened, not as a businessman evaluating opportunity, but as a man realizing the depth of what he had failed to see. Each sentence dismantling the assumptions he had once accepted, each detail revealing a strength he had underestimated. And when she finished, the applause was immediate, not polite, but earned, rising through the room with a sincerity that could not be staged. And Ava stepped back from the podium with the same calm she had carried onto it, her gaze no longer searching, no longer anchored to any one point, because this moment did not belong to the past, it belonged entirely to her. And as the room returned to its rhythm, conversations shifting, alliances forming, Sebastian remained where he stood, the realization no longer distant or abstract, but immediate and undeniable, that the woman he had once questioned now stood beyond his reach, not because she had moved away, but because she had moved forward, and for the first time, he understood that. Some losses were not loud, they were precise, leaving behind a silence that could not be filled by anything else. The applause faded into a softer hum of conversation, but the shift it created did not disappear. It lingered in the air, subtle yet undeniable, and Ava Monroe stepped down from the stage without seeking acknowledgement, her composure unchanged, her focus already moving forward as if the moment had simply been another step in a much larger path. And as she rejoined the flow of the evening, several individuals approached her with interest that was no longer polite but intentional, questions about expansion, partnerships, future plans, and she responded with clarity, her answers precise, her tone measured, never overstating, never diminishing, because she no longer needed to convince anyone of her worth. It was already evident in everything she had built. And across the room, Sebastian Hale finally moved, not with urgency, but with a quiet resolve that came from understanding rather than impulse. Each step closing the distance that had once been defined by assumption, and when he reached her, the space between them held a silence that was not uncomfortable, only honest, and for a moment, neither spoke, because words in this moment required more than habit. They required truth, and Sebastian's voice, when it came, was lower than usual, controlled but stripped of the certainty he once carried so easily. "I was wrong," he said, the statement simple, direct, and without defense. And Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, not cold, not forgiving, simply present, as if weighing not the words themselves but the intention behind them, and she did not respond. Immediately, allowing the silence to exist, to settle, to define the moment rather than rush past it. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same steady strength that had filled the room minutes earlier. "You were," she said, not as an accusation, not as a victory, but as a fact, and there was no edge in her tone, only clarity, and Sebastian nodded slightly, accepting the weight of that truth without resistance, because for the first time, he understood that acknowledgement did not erase consequence. And as the sounds of the gala continued around them, their conversation remained contained, separate from the spectacle, grounded in something far more real, and his gaze shifted briefly, not away from her, but downward, a subtle motion that drew his attention to what he had not allowed himself to consider before, the life that had continued without him, the future he had stepped away from without question. And when he looked back up, there was something different in his expression, not expectation, not entitlement, but recognition. "Is there anything I can do?" he began, the question incomplete in its own way, because even as he asked it, he understood that some things were not his to fix, and Ava held his gaze for a moment longer before shaking her head gently. The movement small but final. "No," she said, her voice soft yet unwavering. "There is not." And there was no bitterness in her response, no lingering anger, only the quiet certainty of someone who had already moved beyond the point of needing anything from him. And the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any rejection could have, because it did not push him away, it simply did not make space for him to return. And for a brief second, something passed through Sebastian's expression, not visible to anyone else, but present enough for him to feel it fully. The understanding that this was not a moment he could negotiate, not a situation he could control, but a reality he had created and now had to accept. And Ava inclined her head slightly, a gesture of closure rather than dismissal, before stepping past him, her path uninterrupted, her direction clear. And as she moved back into the rhythm of the evening, the space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt defined, like a boundary that had been drawn with precision and purpose. And Sebastian remained where he stood, not frozen, not lost, but aware, fully aware of the distance that now existed, not measured in steps or space, but in choices. And across the room, Ava Monroe continued forward, not looking back, not because she could not, but because she no longer needed to. And in that quiet, unwavering movement, the story that had once begun with doubt and loss reached its true conclusion, not in reconciliation, but in something far more powerful, the unshakable presence of a woman who had chosen herself and built a life that no one else could take away.